Hello, people. I was in the mood for rock and roll, meaning rock and roll on live stream. Figured, Sunday night, late August, nothing better to do than to spend it with some random people on the internet that I've probably never acted with and may never. So if anybody has any interesting thoughts, please share. I don't have a specific agenda, but there might be something I could riff on if anybody's interested. Aloha, according to certain respondents. Anything particularly on your minds that you'd like to get off your chest? You could have it be sort of a struggle session where you just release your anxieties and get some group support, almost like a group therapy session. You know how you sort of sit in a circle with people on folding chairs, and some well-intentioned but maybe a little bit oblivious counselor leads the session, and you're asked to talk about a particular theme, usually as it relates to your personal life. And you see where it goes from there. If the counselor is shrewd enough, they can get you to divulge certain secrets that might have been dogging you, but you couldn't quite articulate those thoughts vocally, or maybe you weren't even fully aware of them. Maybe it took being in that setting to get off your chest various anxieties, neuroses, etc., that had diminished your quality of life, but you didn't particularly know about it. You couldn't locate those sentiments within your psyche. And so it took a therapy session to get those out. So that's how I'd like you to think about this live stream. Alrighty, let's see. Now, number one is I have not been drinking. If I appear a little loopy, it's just because I'm a loopy kind of guy. And when it gets past, 10 o'clock at night now, I do find myself getting a little bit loopier. And I used to write a lot at night, but now I find it's just a bad time to really, concentrate one's thoughts, at least for me. And so I almost invariably now have to write in the morning. I don't know if that's some kind of biological or hormonal development that accompanies the aging process. But yeah, I don't know. Night times are a little less productive for me now than they had been in the past. But maybe I'm just kind of concocting that as a justification for myself. And it's not really founded on anything. Some guy says, you're a good guy, Michael, even if you did call me an idiot on Twitter. Well, if you were being an idiot, then I stand by that remark. I guess it depends on what exactly I was reacting to. But on the other hand, I apologize for the incivility. Because even if you are an idiot, maybe you didn't deserve to be called an idiot at that very moment, or maybe you did. Thoughts on the Overstock CEO story with Maria? I followed the Maria Butina case very closely for a while, but I've been putting off looking into the Overstock CEO development just because it seems a little bit overwhelming. I feel like I need to clear out a full half day to really wrap my mind around it. So maybe this is somewhat shameful of me, but I honestly haven't devoted the attentional energy necessary to really figure out what the hell is going on there. So I just have to reserve judgment. Sorry, but I will look into it soon and I'll do something on it. But it's just I started reading the first article that came out in it, and it was just like, okay, I need to actually take a little bit more time to process this. How did you get your start in journalism, Mr. Tracy? Well, it's a good question, I guess. Growing up, I never really conceived of myself as a journalist or going into journalism. It was just never something that had occurred to me. Partly because I think the notion of journalism that is fed to people is a very limiting one, or at least it was back then. Like, I didn't think of myself as somebody who could be like a beat reporter for the local newspaper or something like that. I, wrote for my like high school newspaper, but I almost didn't conceive of that as journalism in a way. I just thought of it as an extension of myself, I guess. And as time went on, when I, thought about it more, I came to understand that the popular conception of journalism that's really foisted upon us by the popular media is arbitrarily constricting. And in fact, it's sort of historical deviation, because going back decades and even centuries, people who were journalists were also very much political actors. Now, there still are political actors now, but they sometimes conceal it. We've had sort of actually a major shift in the journalistic objectivity ethos, and that was something that always bothered me. But it seems like now some journalists have overcorrected, where they're just sort of warriors against Trump 24/7, which kind of leads to other blind spots. So it's just a whole mess. But anyway, as I was growing up and later into my teens and early 20s, I began to think about journalism in terms that were more amenable to me, and realized that the stuff that I wanted to do wasn't inconsistent at all with journalism. So I basically just founded my own magazine in college, and got outside funding, challenged the journalistic establishment of my college, who I did not like, and it was pretty intoxicating. You could just tell in a really sort of tactile way, especially in a setting of a college campus, that what you're doing was having at least some impact, because you could just see people reading the magazine and talking about it. And we even broke some stories. I thought we had a nice little stable of writers, at least for the context of our little campus. And so that was sort of when I caught the bug, I guess. But it was sort of a roundabout trajectory, because I thought I was going to go into politics in some more traditional form, like, I don't know, be an operative or something, work for the government in some way, like a governor, like a senator or a governor or something. I didn't really have a great idea of what I necessarily wanted to do, but I found out that journalism allowed me to give expression to my political instincts in a way where I could, ferret out new information about the world, analyze it, philosophize a bit, and take it from there. Actually, interesting anecdote. I brought Christopher Hitchens to my school, and he did one of his famous atheism versus theism debates. So I actually organized one of those debates, and it was really gratifying. Everybody got a kick out of it. And afterwards, I went out to have drinks with Hitchens, which was a great experience, as you might assume. And I could still distinctly recall one thing he told me, which was it was something to the effect of, what is best for somebody in my position to do. Like, I knew he was a journalist, but it hadn't occurred to me that whatever his style of journalism was could be accessible to me. And he didn't tell me to go into journalism. I asked him, what could somebody do? Because it was, I had asked him something to the effect of, like, if you're into the sort of the cause of secularism, because I was sort of I don't want to say a evangelical atheist or anything, but I was into secular humanism, and I thought that was actually a good proxy for understanding the world, and in particular, the philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, current events. And so, like, what I asked to know, what should one in my position do? And he said, become a philosopher. And that answer always stuck with me, because he didn't say become a journalist, right? He said become a philosopher, because historically, philosophy and journalism were sort of interchangeable fields. Like Karl Marx was a journalist, right? And you have innumerable other examples of that. Even the famous, maybe among the most famous being Mark Twain. I mean, people don't think of Mark Twain as a journalist, but he did acts of journalism for sure. But he was also something of a philosopher. Now, I don't want to be all high and mighty and kind of elevate myself as some kind of philosopher king. But Hitchens' response there did have an impact on me, and it sort of guided how I've approached notions of journalism. It doesn't mean I ever agree with anything Hitchens did. Definitely strongly disagreed on the Iraq War, for instance, which came to define the latter part of his career, or at least part of it. But nonetheless, it's sort of like a general approach to the field of journalism. That's sort of what guided me, and then I just kind of been doing it ever since. And it's not easy. I mean, part of the reason, frankly, why I do these YouTube streams and have the channel now is just because you have to have a diversity of revenue sources, or else a lot of the field is just not sustainable. So some occasionally people will ask me, if they're a little bit younger, what's your advice for getting to journalism? I just say, I honestly don't know. If I knew, I would tell you. Don't expect to live a life of luxury, that's for sure. So that's one little, I guess that's my long-winded response to that question. Okay. Somebody says in the super chat, thank you for the 1999. I'm going to party like it's 1999 while I answer your question. U.S. history shows that third parties aren't viable. It also shows that when one of the two major parties loses touch and fails, a new party arises. Regarding the Democrats, is it better that they die off, or can they be reformed? I don't know that I fully agree that third parties aren't viable. Ross Perot died last month, and he was the most successful third-party candidate. He actually was not technically a third-party candidate. He was independent because he didn't have a party. So it's just one guy who ran in 1992 and ended up being the most successful non-major party candidate since Theodore Roosevelt ran on the Bull Moose party ticket in 1912, right? So the example of Ross Perot alone, I think, would suggest that depending on the cycle, depending on what the political dynamics of the day are, depending on a whole range of other factors, I don't think it's outside the question that a third party could catch fire. Remember, in the early phase of the 2016 Republican primary cycle, a lot of Republicans were extremely paranoid that Trump would run as a third party candidate. And sort of the frame of Trump in that cycle was that he was almost a third party candidate running as a Republican, because so much of what he was advocating was against sort of core Republican orthodoxy. And you could debate to what extent he's actually implemented those orthodoxies in office. I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I don't think waging a trade war as he is now, and ordering companies to do various things, I mean, that's kind of the antithesis of free market Republican capitalistic ethos. And yet most of those elite Republicans support him anyway. So obviously they've accommodated themselves to whatever deviations from orthodoxy that Trump embodies. But it's all just to say that there is a theoretical scenario that you can kind of envision where maybe something went haywire in 2015, 2016, and Trump ran as a third party candidate and potentially, won, and then maybe even a third party. I think what you'd have to see in order for a third party to actually win the presidency is two viable third party candidates running. So one that was more oriented toward the left, maybe one more toward the right, and then you just sort of have a really stratified field where it's totally up in the air, So I don't know that I would rule out the viability of third parties necessarily. That being said, the two parties, if nothing else, over the past couple of years have proven that they are pretty amenable to somewhat dramatic reform from within. I mean, Trump basically co-opting the Republican Party and then, taking it over ideologically would be an example of that. Bernie was really a fringe figure not that long ago, and now he's one of the dominant figures in the Democratic Party and is among the handful of people likely to win the nomination. So that kind of shows that the party structures are relatively fluid, which is really a historical anomaly because in past decades, the parties were parties because you had, like party committees and, local county committees and everything that really set the direction for the party. But now it's sort of more open overall and really lends itself to dramatic shifts. So I don't know, it's sort of a mixed bag. Do you see any use for religion in the current day? Wow. I mean, that's a big question. I feel like I would have to write like a tome on that subject. This is sort of a bizarre admission for me to make, but there are some times when I think that having just a dogmatic religious faith that is, very much structured and has, guiding precepts that I abide by and gives some insight into the numinous, which is a word that I remember Christopher Hitchens used a lot, sort of like the ethereal and the abstractions of the universe. Sometimes I think that would be personally beneficial for me. The trouble is, I just don't believe it really on a metaphysical level, especially theism, monotheism, the Abrahamic religions. I just was too immersed in the various theological arguments for those belief systems to really, on just a basic epistemological level, ever affirm their truth. So for me, that's just not ever a hurdle I could really clear, in terms of a personal practice, But if you're willing to suspend that disbelief, or you believe in it, or whatever, I could see why it would give your life meaning and structure. It's just I was always sort of interested in cultivating alternative, like through secular humanism, that gave the same kind of meaning and structure, but didn't require beliefs in extraordinary propositions about the nature of the universe and so forth, right? Let's see. Are Hong Kong protests a U.S. color revolution? I don't know. I think the implication of the question is that it's sort of being fostered by the U.S. And then kind of been given the guise of a grassroots uprising because that's how the U.S. wants it portrayed, because that would further their interests. I don't know that the U.S. While there are people who are declaring their support for Hong Kong, the Hong Kong protesters, I don't know that it's necessarily in the U.S. interest to have a sort of like rebellion of that sort going on right now between Hong Kong and China. I mean, I think that sort of internal instability may not actually be to the benefit of the U.S. because it could compromise various economic situations, and it could. I think it's sort of in the interest of the U.S. for China to be as stable as possible, right? So having China like fend off an uprising like that, where it could lead to violence or any other kind of outbreak of hostilities, is not something I think is really in the U.S. interest. It's not as if the U.S. is in like a formal Cold War posture with with China yet. Although certain people would like that. I think President Tom Cotton in 2026 or something might institute that. But no, I don't know that I would necessarily characterize it as sort of like a U.S. directed op. And a lot of the color revolutions in Europe in the early to the mid 2000s backfired on the U.S. So, it didn't really end up the way that the people who were sort of helping to engineer that wanted. But then again, the U.S. foreign policy establishment never learns from its past errors, so you could be right that there could be an element of that. Okay, somebody makes a crazy statement that I'm not going to repeat here, but thanks for the super chat anyway. You have to deal with that on occasion. Somebody asks, so there are some people who ask questions who, if I were to read them aloud, it would probably get me in trouble in some way. So, just out of self-preservation, I don't know that I'm going to answer every single one of these super chats because you don't know what trolls are up to necessarily. I'm not saying you're a troll necessarily, but sometimes people clip out clips from these videos and trying to make you look bad. So got to be a little bit cautious. Let's see. Somebody says the National Endowment for Democracy awarded just over 29 million in grants to Asia focused on organizing in Hong Kong. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously if you think that there was an interest in fomenting a color revolution, as someone mentioned, in Hong Kong, there'd be signs of that from the top. But we're in a situation now where Trump, at least rhetorically, doesn't seem to have much of an interest in fostering a revolution of that kind, and is more interested in sort of like, in a sense, extending olive branch of friendliness to Xi. But even at the same time, there are probably elements within his administration and the government apparatus more widely that are interested in fomenting a color revolution style uprising, but you're not really getting that sense from the president, which is historically where you think that would be coming from. So it's a sort of a mixed dynamic right now. Somebody asks, why is Sam Cedar so insufferable? See, and trying to bait me into getting into a YouTube flame war. I don't know. Ask him. Ask him, why are you so insufferable, and see what he says. I don't watch his show, so I'm not in a great position to really expound on his insufferability or lack thereof. I know that in the interactions that I've had with him, he has been a tad insufferable to, and I'm trying to be intentionally understated there. He screamed at me. He had a hissy fit, called me a coward. People who've known him for a long time said that was the angriest they've ever seen him get on his YouTube, on his show. Like, he was just an emotional wreck. And I still don't quite understand why. I mean, I think it was because somebody, in part, was challenging him on his approach toward an issue, meaning Trump Russia at the time, that's what it was about, our quote confrontation, where it's not just some standard right wing troll trying to get a rise out of him. I was trying to make a relatively, I thought, nuanced case as to how he had misinformed his audience by allowing only somebody as deranged and deluded as Marcy Wheeler to be the authority in his show on the subject of Trump Russia. And Marcy Wheeler is just she's mad. In how British people say crazy people are mad. She's mad. And so I thought that was a disservice to his audience, especially considering that many of them may have been amenable to a argument on Trump Russia that went against the conventional wisdom among the Democrats propagating that insane narrative. So I thought it was worthwhile to criticize him on that point, just as I was other quote independent progressive media would follow MSNBC down the Russia rabbit hole, and we're not having to face any accountability for it. And he got really angry. But I try to maintain sort of a sense of remove from these things. I don't take really any of it personally, or at least I try not to. I try to work it out so that my consciousness is separate, bifurcated, or something, so I'm not taking any of these online criticisms as some kind of deep indictment of me as an individual, or else I probably would have killed myself a long time ago. Somebody asks, do you think from all the minorities in the Middle East, the reasons Kurds are being brought in mainstream media is the expansion of Israel via the establishment of Kurdistan, aka the balkanization of Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran? I don't know. Are you saying that Kurds are being brought into the mainstream media? I don't know of that many examples of that. So if you have any specifics, tell me. I think probably during the early and mid 2000s, there were a lot of Kurds who were given platforms because they sort of incidentally supported the case for invasion and occupation of Iraq. And they could provide sort of an alternative Iraqi perspective that gave credence or gave license to, the pro-war line. But I don't know that you see that as much anymore. I could be wrong, but let me know. The other thing with the Sam Cedar people is that I find that some of the most annoying trolls now that go after me constantly are people associated with him. And it's just I've offered to talk to him on a more extended basis. I'll basically talk to anybody, as you guys know. And, he's declined apparently, which is fine. I guess that's his prerogative, but it's just weird to troll somebody when they are constantly offering to have dialogue, right? And some of these people online are just relentless, which, I can deal with. It's nothing new. I get trolled from different people across the spectrum, but, it's just a very bizarre thing because, I criticized him one time and then it turned into this months-long ordeal where he was doing he was mentioning me not every other day, but several times. And, it just caused a lot of drama. And the point of me making the criticism in the first place was not to stoke drama. It was to raise what I thought was a legitimate point of criticism about an issue that had occasioned spectacular failure across the media spectrum, including in independent media, where you think that there would be sort of the resources available to resist or withstand mainstream groupthink. Somebody asked me, what's my experience with X person and Y person? I'm not going to talk about that. I mean, it's nothing scandalous, but I don't want to get into these sort of petty interpersonal feuds. It's just not worth it. But thank you for being so attuned to Twitter drama that you could even be in a position to ask that question. I'll just say that, I have a positive experience on a personal level with pretty much everybody I deal with, but there's a weird dynamic where when that gets translated into online interaction, it just becomes a hellhole. And I don't know that it's unique to me, but I do find that to be a pretty common thing where people who you seem to be on good terms with in real life, when you interact with them, then turn around and are spitting fire and just calling you the worst names in the book on the internet. And I'm sure I've probably been guilty of that in the past. But not worth dwelling on. Michael, cheers to your work. Thank you. Thank you, anonymous person. Do you know anything about Peter Friedrich's work, Criticisms of Gabbard? Would you consider interview? Yeah, I consider it. I'd have to look into it more. I think I've heard of him. I think people have sent me various things that he's done. But I'll look it up. I'll look it up. I'm not going to make a guarantee on anything, but Somebody asked, "What is the origin of your avatar on Twitter?" Good question. Actually, not a great question. A little bit trivial, frankly, but I'll answer it anyway. The past 2 avatars on Twitter I've had other people make for me. And usually I've I offered to pay the people in both instances, but the one I've been using now since 2016, which is sort of like a I don't even know what you call it, an illustration of my face in sort of like the bluish gray tones, was done by a guy, I think, who just I've been trying to find that guy who made it. His name was, I believe, M_cetera, like a play on words of etc. So if any of you know this guy, let me know. I'm trying to reestablish contact with him or her, I guess, who just offered really to make it for free. In 2016, when I was looking for a new avatar, because the one that I had for 2 years prior was a little obnoxious. And so the origin of it is that somebody offered to make it for me. And I said, okay, make it. And they sent it to me. Thank you, Michael, libertarian, who appreciates your level-headed approach to media. Thank you. I've always dealt constructively with libertarians. More so in the past when, if you might remember, like in the early Obama years, there was this alleged libertarian moment when, Rand Paul got elected and Ron Paul did fairly well, and you have Justin Amash get elected and so forth, and there was this rise of especially youth-oriented libertarian organizations like Students for Liberty and such. I went to a bunch of their events and wrote about them, but the libertarian moment has passed, so it seems like a little bit of an antiquated thing almost. But I've written, I used to write for Reason Magazine. So if you're interested, search my name in Reason Magazine. You'll see some articles that I wrote for them that I think still hold up. Somebody asks, what will Tulsi do if she misses the debate? Well, number one, she won't drop out. And I think, while obviously she would love to make the debate, and I think it would be much better if she was in it, there's a silver lining there where if she doesn't make, let's say she doesn't make the debate. So today is the 25th, right? And we have 3 days to 3 days till the deadline for polling. I almost think it could be good for her in a way, because I think she'll just totally let loose, right? Then at that point, she's got nothing to lose. She'll, maybe let her guard down more, maybe go after people more directly, attack the DNC more explicitly, just kind of enter into like Tulsi smash mode, where maybe she does more unconventional media. I think the backlash from her being excluded to the debate could actually redound to her benefit in a way, because it will energize her supporters, highlight the absurdity of the fact that she's excluded, bring attention to like some of the fallacies of the process itself, and in a way maybe give her a boost. So yeah, would it be much better for her to be in the debates? Sure, but I think there's a way to work it where you could actually make a make lemonade out of lemons. The best. I think the one person who could single handedly make a difference is if Joe Rogan went on a rampage about it. Not a rampage, but if he criticized the decision to exclude Tulsi, which he may do. And if you have Joe Rogan going after the DNC, people are going to listen. It's interesting because I think the Bernie interview with Joe Rogan actually changed some attitudes toward Joe Rogan as sort of like an actor, within the even left-leaning political sphere, because a lot of people agree that was one of Bernie's best interviews that he's done this campaign cycle. So I think Joe Rogan now has some credibility to opine on issues related to the Democratic primary process. And if he were to really make a strong case that Tulsi was wrongly excluded, then that could galvanize some energy. So I think it actually could be good for her in a way. Maybe I'm just trying to rationalize it, but in any event, the two qualifying polls that she has now carry over to the October debate. So she has every incentive to stay in the event that she gets 2 additional polls between now and I think mid to late September, which is the qualifying cutoff for the October debates. Yeah, so she's not going to go anywhere, and I think she's committed to seeing this out. So. How do you stay online as a journalist, email, etc.? Not sure exactly what you mean, but I have, I have encrypted email. I have Proton Mail and PGP. I'm forgetting the acronym now. Yeah, PGP encryption. And that information is always on my website, so people contact me sometimes for that. Proton Mail is much easier now, although I guess maybe that's susceptible to some kind of hacking or whatever. And then I use Signal, Signal, which is encrypted text, and that's about it. Sometimes I've had people anonymously approach me in person at public events and hand me stuff and not reveal who they are. And I've had bizarre, that was really bizarre. I'm going to have to write about that experience someday. Hitchens picking Mother Teresa as enemy number 1 was always very odd to me. The name of his book on Mother Teresa was The Missionary Position. And it's a good book. And I don't think Hitchens identified her as enemy number 1. He just objected to how she was valorized in sort of a very almost saccharine way, very cheap and nostalgic, and in a way they didn't actually examine what her actual her deeds were. I mean, he would always cite how she had relations with corrupt autocrats, and was an anti-abortion zealot and that kind of thing. I don't think the Hitchens was identifying her as enemy number 1, but one of the people who had sort of been sanctified in the media without a thorough examination of who she was or what her political disposition was. Audio is choppy, somebody says. Is it choppy for others, or is it just that one dude who's maybe got spotty Wi-Fi? Hopefully it's not widespread. Not choppy, somebody replies. Okay. Hitchens went soft on Israel after learning that his mother was Jewish. I don't know. I think Hitchens is actually pretty consistent on Israel. meaning a critic of Zionism and of the Israeli state, really for much of his career, even when he was an Iraq war advocate, which kind of which really starkly differentiated him from most Iraq war advocates. He managed to come up with a rationalization that combined both sort of the neoconservative outlook on regime change in Iraq with a fairly strident critique of Israel in solidarity with the Palestinians. So I think he might have been the only person in the media universe to take that view. He was buddies with Paul Wolfowitz, for crying out loud. Somebody says of Hitchens. That is true. Hitchens was embraced by members of the Bush administration, such as Wolfowitz, the kind of preeminent neocon ideologue. And he really allowed his zeal for that issue to cloud his judgment just in terms of who he was really associating with. I mean, it's fine to meet with people, it's fine to even maybe socialize with people, but to become part of their sort of ideological cohort is a step too far. But so a lot of Hitchens' earlier stuff at the Nation magazine is really good, especially throughout the Clinton years and even during the Reagan years. I mean, he was one of the better critics of Reagan and Thatcher, and his views on Israel Palestine really stems back to then and didn't waver really much at all, as far as I know or remember. Let's see. Hitchens would rely too much on his wit at times and would get lazy in his arguments and research. The thing was, his wit was just so unparalleled that it did give him just a built-in advantage over anybody that he was ever interacting with, whether in writing or orally, that you kind of understand why he relied on it so much, to the point where it, substituted for the critical examination of the issues that you might have expected from him earlier in his career, especially when he got such a huge reputation as an orator and as sort of just almost a performance artist, not even to diminish his performance, but that sort of became his character, So, there's something to that. Somebody asks, will Dems go full idpol once they get rid of Tulsi? One thing that I hope Tulsi does, if she has to go beast mode, if she gets excluded from the debate, is to really spend a little more time elaborating on her critiques of identity politics, not just because I think there's a big desire out there for her to expound on that, and because she's a uniquely well-positioned figure to level that critique, but because I think it would really cause a big firestorm, which is kind of what she would need to do, which she needs to get her polls up. I think she'd have to create distinctions between herself and the rest of the field. So if she just kind of like went whole hog on that subject in an extended form, then I think that that would be a strategically sound move for her. I think there's some who are going to pander, especially to the id poll stuff. Bernie sort of struck a balance where he does pander a bit, but it's sort of all undergirded by just the class consciousness argument of his. So I think that's why a lot of people are willing to tolerate when he now and then does indulge in some kind of superficial identity pandering, because it's not strictly pandering if it's coupled with a class-based critique that's been consistent from him for decades. So I mean, that's why people kind of are willing to overlook a little now and then when he does sort of a rhetorical indulgence. So I think. But yeah, they probably will go all the way on identity stuff, which probably won't work out so well in a general election context, but you never know. Tim Vigil gives $5 without asking any question. Thank you. It saves me some energy. Tulsi needs to stay in as long as possible. Somebody says, give her delegates to Bernie at the convention. Yeah, I think one reason why I found it odd that Jay Inslee dropped out this week is because he was supposed to be a, quote, message candidate, and he had just passed the $130,000 donor threshold on Monday, and then by Wednesday he dropped out. And if you were really running a message campaign, you would think that it wouldn't be contingent on your polling success or whether you're in the debates. You just want to continue spreading the message. And so that means that you would be one of the last people you'd expect to drop out, right? Because you could still have a form of some kind to continue spreading the message if you're just an active presidential candidate. So that's why I think there's something a little sketchy about him dropping out when he did. But Tulsi, I think, the one factor she would have to weigh is if she was, fully out of contention, would she then want to run again in the Hawaii for her seat in Hawaii? And I think the deadline for that would be in December, if I'm not mistaken. So that's going to be a decision you'll have to deal with at some point. Somebody says DNC will decide on nominee independent voters. I don't think it's worth being fatalist about the DNC and its ability to unilaterally decide who the nominee is. There were some serious reforms made between 2016 and now, especially in terms of superdelegates, that I think decrease the ability of the DNC to put its finger on the scales as it had in 2016. That's why I haven't really gone with the rigging explanation for why Tulsi is potentially going to be excluded, because I don't know that it's a fully conscious orchestrated attempt to silence her in particular. I think that they just, by using these totally illogical, arbitrary criteria, they're disadvantaging candidates who have otherwise demonstrated that they have adequate grassroots support to merit inclusion in the debates. It's a sort of a different argument than just saying rigged. Although it's funny to me that certain people dismiss rigging as just this preposterous concept when, as I said on Tucker, on Friday, and I've repeated on Twitter, everybody from Donna Brazile, who was the interim chair of the DNC, to Elizabeth Warren and others, including Bernie himself, said that the previous process was rigged. But they say it was rigged because it was rigged specifically to favor a certain candidate, Hillary, and to disadvantage her opponents. And now I think that there are so many more candidates, and you have the establishment a little bit more fractured. There are some with Harris, some with Warren, maybe some with Buttigieg, etc. And even, honestly, to a lesser extent, Biden, although there's still some people with Biden. You can't really rig the process to advantage one particular candidate at this time. You could just institute arbitrary criteria to sort of prematurely cut off the field. I think that's what Tulsi is being disadvantaged by. So that's sort of how I'm sort of characterizing it at this point. Somebody says Hillary announced 2 hours ago. Don't scare me like that. It's funny because if you look at the betting markets, if you go to this website that I've mentioned before, it's 2020. What's the website? Electionbettingodds.com. They have the Democratic primary, the U.S. presidency, and the Republican primary. And Hillary is ahead in terms of Hillary's likelihood to win the Democratic primary, right? She is ahead of Cory Booker, Tulsi Gabbard, Beto O'Rourke, Julian Castro, Amy Klobuchar, Kirsten Gillibrand, and other candidates who are actually running. So the betting markets think that there's a greater chance that Hillary will win the nomination than more than half of the field. So, obviously the betting markets aren't ruling out the possibility that she runs. I think it's at this point, it's a very faint possibility. But it makes sense to sort of price that into the betting market calculation. Interestingly, if you look at Trump's reelection odds, they've gone down quite a bit over the past week, having to do with the economy, probably because he sort of like single-handedly tanked the stock market with a tweet on Friday. And even Trump's odds of winning the Republican primary now are down to 87%, which is still high, but down from this high point. But I think that makes sense. I think Trump does have a less than 50% chance of winning the election. So 44% actually sounds about right to me. Obviously, it'll depend on who the nominee is for the Democrats, but I think just in a vacuum, that seems about accurate for Trump. Let's see. Somebody says she's smart, she's strong. Yeah, I saw that video. The guy who took that video of the Kamala people protesting Bernie, or seeming to walk out and making a noisy fuss as he was speaking. There was some dispute as to whether they were actually protesting him or whether they were doing something else. Either way, they looked stupid. But the guy who took that video is John Graziano, who I worked with at the Young Turks for a while, and he's a cool guy. He was on my side on various issues within the Young Turks. So he got some good footage there. It was at the DNC meeting in San Francisco. So doing some independent journalism there. And I'm not blazing marijuana. It's just a vape thing. Nicotine to keep my stamina up. Somebody asks, what interest within the Republican Party, if any, can you attribute to helping stifle Trump's seemingly dormant Mexican border wall campaign promise? Well, it all stems back to what you could call the original sin of the Trump presidency, which is that he outsourced his legislative agenda on day one to Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell. And he brought people into the executive branch, such as Reince Priebus, who encouraged that outsourcing, and Trump went along with it. And they decided to immediately focus on Obamacare repeal, which shot any bipartisan goodwill he might have had to cut some kind of deal, which could have included infrastructure, maybe some wall funding, etc. There's an alternate universe in which Trump immediately went to infrastructure when he assumed office, and maybe worked in some immigration-related provisions, and probably would have been better off for him in the long run, because the Republicans ended up getting their butts handed to them anyway in the midterms. So I attribute it to his inability to think outside the box, inability or lack of desire to think outside the box in terms of his personnel when he was staffing the government. And the interest within the Republican Party that you could attribute to that were the ones who coalesced around him and basically co-opted the staffing process, where you didn't have a whole lot of bona fide, quote, Trumpists. It was sort of like, Steve Bannon yelling into the, screaming into the wilderness, and that's sort of what I attributed to, was the legislative strategy that they undertook. And that was why it was so ridiculous when Trump shut down the government for the longest shutdown in history in December and January of this year, because he waited 2 years before he made a stand on the wall issue when he had total control of the government for 2 years, and he didn't use his bully pulpit to really advocate for that supposed priority of his. Did he ever actually prioritize the wall, or was it just sort of a marketing tactic? I think there are arguments either way on that. I think definitely it was an effective marketing tactic, and it probably still will be for him, because he can blame everybody but himself for why that didn't get done. But we'll see. Somebody says, what do you think of Joe Walsh potentially running against Trump? Well, he announced today that if he officially is running against Trump, so it's not potential. I find it, there are a lot of liberals who are really excited by it because it means that Trump could be weaker than he otherwise might have been if you have an active primary challenge. I don't know. I think Joe Walsh might do like very, very marginally better than you might expect, just because people expect him to get like 0.0%. And if he ends up getting like 5%, then, that's something, that's at least something. Most incumbent presidents do not have any primary challenge at all. And whether you want to consider Trump or Walsh a serious primary challenger, I guess is an open question. It's possible that Mark Sanford also runs. William Weld is also running. So those are three, reasonably high-profile people who are running in a primary against the incumbent president. That sort of says something unto of itself. There was no primary challenge whatsoever for Obama in 2012. There was none for Bush in 2004. There was none for Clinton in 1996. And there was for George H.W. Bush in 1992. That was really the last time, and that harmed him electorally. Pat Buchanan running against him and doing much better than people thought was possible in the early primaries. And of course, Ted Kennedy running against Jimmy Carter hurt him a lot in 1980. So I don't know that Joe Walsh really rises to the level of a Pat Buchanan or a Ted Kennedy. But, Joe Walsh combined with William Weld, combined with Mark Sanford, that, could get up to maybe 10, 15% of the Republican electorate. And, that could weaken Trump somewhat, which is, I think, part of why he's gone down a little bit in the betting markets recently, and why, I think that makes sense. But, Joe Walsh personally, I mean, that's kind of a joke. I mean, he claims that he's had this, like, great epiphany in the past 2 years where he's, very apologetic about how he helped enable Trump, and Trump made Joe Walsh reevaluate all his positions and stuff. I don't know that I really buy that. It might be true on some level, but I found it took me 2 minutes to go and find a tweet of him in 2016 and 2017 calling for all Muslims to be banned from the U.S., which is like Trump's signature policy proposal, which he didn't actually do, but he did a version of it, I guess. So I just don't. Joe Walsh doesn't have really an ideological criticism of Trump. He has a characterological criticism of Trump, and that really, it's hard to imagine how that goes particularly far. Somebody asked, notice Kamala's cackle is similar to Hillary's. Now that you mention it, you're right. Kamala, I think, uses her laughter as sort of a deflection tactic. I think Hillary kind of pathologically did the same thing. So maybe there's something similar mentally going on with them in that sense. Let's see. All right, people, getting up to the hour point. I hope you all felt this was a cathartic session for you. Remember, I said this was going to be sort of a group therapy thing where you could really self-reflect and get stuff off your back, and try to use the forum of this group session to really get deep into your psyche and exercise all those demons that have been getting you down and making your life go off course. So I'm happy I could provide that for you, and it's free of charge, except those of you who give a generous super chat contribution. And with that, good night.